Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of ORF, let me welcome all of you this afternoon here. I apologize for my very bad throat because of this pollution. This year, we are celebrating the 70 years of the Geneva Convention, a great international document which has worked reasonably well, or very well, that is for the panelists to say, that in times of war and conflict, which unfortunately are the realities of the world, there has to be some convention and some rules by which it's played. So we will go into the details of the Geneva Convention and how in this changing world and unchanged, are the protections unchanged, or is there need for a relook at them? To discuss these things, we have a very, very competent panel here. There is Eva Svoboda, who is the Deputy Director of International Law and Policy at the Icrc. And I must add here that when I was ambassador in Côte d'Ivoire, Abidjan, I had excellent relations with the Icrc, and we worked together because of the crisis in Sierra Leone, to which I was concurrently accredited. 6 of the Mother Teresa nuns were kidnapped by the RUF rebels, and it was just touch and go, and it was thanks to the Icrc assistance and help that we were able to get them out of the clutches of the rebels. So she will speak on legal practices and practical measures to improve the IHL implementation. Then we have Mr. Srinivas Burra, who is the assistant professor in the South Asian University, and he will speak on strengthening international and humanitarian law. And finally, there is my colleague in the Foreign Service. We serve together in the headquarters, Mr. Asoke Mukerji. Now he is a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation. He is the most ideal person to speak on India's contribution to global humanitarian operations and the way forward, because he was India's permanent representative at the UN in New York. So without much ado, may I request Eva to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much for the kind words and for the invitation today to speak here. 196, I wanted to throw that into the room. 196 states, all of them, have universally ratified the Geneva Conventions. I think it's important to start out maybe with that remark. The Geneva Conventions were a vital pledge born out of the horrors of World War II, and it's quite amazing actually today to look back and realize that it was only 4 years after World War II that states came together and managed to, in a fairly short time frame, to agree on these Geneva Conventions. I'm not sure that would be possible today. They embody really a very pragmatic set of rules where military necessity and humanity are put in the balance. Very pragmatic in a sense that military commanders can look at what is the military necessity, but what are the humanitarian consequences or considerations. It is really a set of laws which calls upon commanders and states to really respect each other, even the enemy, as a human being. When international humanitarian law is respected, then harm is reduced to civilians, and every day we really see that it's working. And I'm particularly pleased that you mentioned a positive example, because one could be forgiven to think that they don't work. When we turn on the TV, we listen to the radio, it's quite normal to think it's really a set of outdated laws that don't really work, because all we see on TV is misery. But there are very good examples that show us that they do work, and you just brought us one. There are plenty of others where, when I think about injured people when they are allowed to pass a checkpoint, or when civilians receive food, when we are able to visit detainees, but also, for example, when families receive news of their loved ones. So these are all examples, and I've been to different countries in the past 2 decades that I've been working with the ICRC, and it always struck me how important these maybe seemingly small gestures are, but they are vital for the civilian population. And so I think today, when we watch the news and see only bad news, it is important that we, in a sense, renew the defense, that there's a fierce public defense of these rules and regulations, and that we support humanitarian activities because they're vital for civilians. So while I say that we have good examples, that is not to say that there aren't violations. And I think it's very important also to point that out. We are realistic. We know how difficult it is today. And it essentially comes down to a lack of implementation and non-compliance. And that remains probably the biggest challenge today that we have. And it's the civilians that then suffer. In some contexts, we observe that states, armed forces, and non-state armed actors, so on both sides, they lack, for example, knowledge on international humanitarian law, or perhaps they're not adequately trained. Looking at the gravity of offenses, we also see sometimes that there is lack of training, lack of knowledge, as I said, but also sometimes really deliberate lack of respect or disregard for these rules. Moreover, in recent years, we have increasingly heard arguments that certain groups are outside of the protection of these laws, and that is particularly worrisome. So there's sometimes a discourse that says, my enemy does not deserve the same protection as I would. And that is very disconcerting. And even if IHL rules are in principle accepted or applied, then perhaps they're interpreted in a way that are much more permissive and allow armies maybe to do things that they would otherwise not do. So what are some of the ways forward to strengthen the implementation of existing international humanitarian law obligations? One important element, and we probably will hear about it later on, is national implementation. So while international humanitarian law or the Geneva Conventions, they're international legal treaties, they need to be translated into domestic law, and that is an important prerequisite. The Geneva Conventions actually established a very clear legal obligation for all states to adopt national legislation implementing these rules. In practice, what we see is, and the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, assists states in these endeavors, have gone well beyond these obligations and have developed additional measures. One of them is, for example, the establishment on national committees or similar bodies on international humanitarian law. And what these bodies do, they encompass or they bring together various different stakeholders around the table. That can be the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, the National Red Cross or Red Crescent Society, then other ministerial bodies. And what they do is really they discuss how the Geneva Conventions or international humanitarian law more broadly can be implemented into a domestic context. For the rules and principles of IHL to effectively protect people in armed conflict, they must be known, implemented, and complied with. And that also includes the general public. And it's true that if you asked anyone on the street in Delhi, would they have heard of the Geneva Conventions? Possibly they would have. Would they really know what they actually mean? Perhaps not. And so it's also important that just populations know what the Geneva Conventions are, that also, for example, the Red Cross or the Red Crescent, that they're protected emblems. It's also important to, in a sense, when I say translate, in different languages, yes, and we know, for example, that the Geneva Conventions have been translated into 43 languages so far, but I also mean the local as in local understanding. The Geneva Conventions might seem a bit dry when you read them, so they need to be translated, they need to be understood, also the values that underpin them, and I think that's very important. So there are a range of measures that states can take. The first of all, and it's actually the first sentence in the Geneva Conventions, and that is the respect and ensure respect for applicable international humanitarian law in all circumstances of armed conflicts in good faith. Like I said, they need to be translated, armed forces need to be trained. So quite often what we do, and we do that in fact also here in India and elsewhere, we engage with armed forces. We look at their training manuals. We engage with them on how soldiers, officers can be best trained. So when they do go into combat, they understand what their legal obligations are. It's important to adopt measures to prevent the misuse of the Red Cross and Red Crescent and other symbols, for example. It's also important to take into account international humanitarian law when selecting military sites and other areas, but also in the choice of weapons, for example. So there are a number of different things that states can do. In addition, we would always call that all IHL, international humanitarian law treaties, are ratified, explore methods to promote respect of IHL, but also to promote and they use guidelines for the success of national IHL committees. And I think an important role is also played by parliamentarians, and we have in fact a guidebook as well, or a handbook for parliamentarians, because these are the persons who then pass laws, including also, for example, laws that protect the Red Cross, Red Crescent emblem. And so I think they play an important part. What we also stress is, and that's something that has changed over recent years, so conflicts are fought increasingly in coalitions. It's no longer perhaps one state against another, but it's maybe a coalition, a group of various states fighting each other, or non-state armed groups. And so it's also important to ensure that when one state supports another state, that they ensure that there is really respect for international humanitarian law. And so we have discussions with states on these obligations as well. Another area where we put a lot of emphasis on is on the judiciary, that judges understand international humanitarian law, which is not a given. Judges obviously are trained in domestic law, but also attorneys, magistrates, that they are trained in IHL. What are some of the challenges? And maybe I'll go over just a few. I mean, there are quite a few, but I will focus just on a couple. One is, besides the fact that conflicts are fought more in coalitions, they're also fought more in urban areas. When you imagine maybe old pictures or photos, there would be a battlefield and two armies would face each other. That's no longer the case. As I mentioned, they're more fighting in coalitions, but also conflicts are fought more in urban areas, so densely populated areas. And that poses a specific set of challenges. Not only is it important that armies then choose the right weapons, because what happens in urban or populated areas is that particular weapons might have an impact, much more so than on an open battlefield. And what does that mean? This has consequences for civilians. For example, if a water treatment station is bombed or is damaged, that has repercussions for civilians. So it's not only that civilians get probably killed more likely in an urban area if the same weapons are used that would otherwise be used in an open battlefield, but the consequences as well are quite long-lasting, that just the physical infrastructure that is damaged. So we need to understand how some of these obligations work in urban warfare. The other area that I briefly would like to touch upon is the climate. So international humanitarian law does not speak about climate or climate change as such, although it does have provisions about the environment, and in particular, things in the environment that are important for the survival of civilians. So that is one element. That's the legal element of the environment that is really protected because because civilians need to use it. But then what we're looking at as well is climate and conflict. We found that in our work, and I'd like to just mention perhaps one region, and that's the Sahel, where you have a situation where civilians are not only caught up in conflict, but there is a double shock in a sense that it's conflict and climate. And so people are doubly vulnerable in a sense, not just to the conflict, but to climate. And we need to make sure that that people affected by these dual shocks receive the assistance that they need. But of course, that's not just about assistance, it's much more longer term, and we need to be able to address that. That is certainly a topic that we've been looking at for some time now. I'd like to finish maybe just to say that we've recently published what we call the Challenges Report. So it's a report where we look at current challenges to international humanitarian law. It's on our website as well, and there you will see what are some of the challenges that we've identified that we will need to face. This will also be discussed at the next international conference, so the International Conference of the Red Cross Red Crescent Movement, which will take place in early December. And it actually brings together all the signatories of the Geneva Conventions, all the Red Cross Red Crescent societies, the Federation, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we'll be discussing some of these challenges and how to address them in future. Because ultimately, what we're trying to do is to say the Geneva Conventions, yes, they might be fairly old, 70 years old, but they're still relevant, they matter, they do work despite the violations, and we have to continue to encourage and call on state and non-state armed actors to respect them, because what they do is protect those who need it the most. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eva, for that very comprehensive presentation. You went into the historical aspect as well as brought it to the present times. And what interested me was that you said that it's on your website, the challenges to IHL. I'm going to visit the website and read it, because as you were speaking, one aspect struck me very much. The nature of warfare itself is changing. In the last 70 years, warfare is not the same today as it was. There are also non-state actors who are the main participants in the warfare today. So under such circumstances, how is the IHL working? Or do you think there has to be a fresh thinking on how to deal or modify the Geneva Convention, or have another addendum to the Geneva Convention? I would like to hear from you on that. Now let me come to Professor Srinivas Burra. He will speak on strengthening international humanitarian law and the compliance by state in light of contemporary challenges.
Thank you.
Which will also take into account the changing nature of warfare and the changing nature of conflicts.
Yes, I'll try to do a bit of that. Thank you very much. I'll start from where Eva has left, the recent Icrc report on the contemporary challenges to international humanitarian law. Without going into the details of what that report says, but if you just quickly run through the contents of it, in fact, it captures almost everything that what we think of as a serious challenge to not just for the international humanitarian law, but other aspects of international law like human rights and refugee issues. Roughly, it says that artificial intelligence, non-state actors, counter-terrorism, climate change, and those who work are in between terrorism and combatants. So there are several issues which have been pointed out as serious challenges to the contemporary international humanitarian law framework. On the other hand, as she rightly pointed out with regard to the Geneva Conventions, probably I think the number of challenges that are growing, which are posing a kind of a challenge to international humanitarian law framework, the growth of law, the development of law seems to be not in pace with sometimes it seems to be not in pace with the challenges that are happening. But there are certain fundamental categories probably which have the potential to address even the contemporary challenges to it. Therefore, the question comes in is that where the really states stand in relation to compliance with their obligations under international humanitarian law, but broadly it also addresses other aspects of international law. So if you go into the basics of how a state can really comply with its obligations under international. So the first requirement, at least so far as Geneva Conventions are concerned, they are universally accepted. So therefore, there is not much of a debate whether a state is complying with it or not in terms of becoming a party to it. But there are several other treaties which have later on become part of international humanitarian law, like additional protocols and several other weapons treaties, to which not all the states are parties, including countries like India, which are not parties to additional protocols, though they are parties to the Geneva Conventions part of it. But when it comes to whether a state should accept a particular international treaty or not, mostly we look at from the point of view of states, in the sense that how the state's interests are placed in relation to a particular international treaty. Means that how a particular state is placed in relation to other states as part of international institutions and international community. So therefore, whether a state should become a party to an international treaty, largely it is a state's prerogative, despite the fact that we try to look at even to critique that from the point of view of victims and armed conflict situations. But still, I think we need to give a considerable space to states' understanding of why they want to become a party and why they do not want to become a party to a particular state. That is one stage of it. But once a state becomes a party to an international treaty, I think the situation should change. Because when a state does not become a party to an international treaty, it may also have an argument to say that I don't need to become a party to a treaty, but still I have certain domestic mechanisms which will take care of some of the conflicts, issues or victims of conflict situations. But a state, once become a party to a treaty, probably I think state loses that kind of an argument, and it should lose that argument in the sense of Still, I look at after becoming a party to a treaty, in terms of its compliance with it, in terms of implementation and enforcement part of it, I think that no longer it can take the excuse of some interference coming in or some international factors working in it. Because the moment once a state accepts it, especially with regard to humanitarian law and broadly human rights treaties, now from that moment onwards, it has to be looked at from the point of view of victims' point of view, in the sense that the individual victims, whether it's a conflict or whether it's the victims of a human rights situation. So therefore, when a state becomes a party to it, we see that how it is being implemented. So the first requirement generally happens is that, which we see in the context of India, that it is a party to the 4 conventions and also it has a national legislation, 1960 Geneva Convention. But extremely important example that probably I think is that the kind of memorandum of understanding India still has with Icrc in terms of some of the conflict areas in relation to Kashmir, which is in fact it is towards the implementation and compliance with it, which is a good model which goes beyond the national legislation part of it. But the next step comes in is that how effectively that is being complied with in terms of its enforcement part. Now that is where I think we need to look at a state, whichever the state is, whether it is India or United States, somewhere I think the victim's point of view should play a significant role in terms of evaluating a state's compliance with or not. Now whether one likes it or not, I think international law has moved a lot from the state-centric understanding to individual-centric understanding, so far as individual criminal responsibility, human rights point of view are concerned. So I'm not saying that everything is good with that kind of a movement from the state-centric understanding to individual-centric understanding. There are certain challenges with regard to it, which are more in relation to law, but in terms of the practical policy issues are involved. But somewhere I think a state has to engage with those issues as to how this shift is happening from state-centrism to individual-centrism so far as human rights and humanitarian law is concerned. So that is one aspect of it as to how a state complies with in terms of becoming a party to an international treaty, and after that complying with it by way of implementing it and by way of enforcing it wherever it is required, both through legal mechanisms as well as legal mechanisms in the form of law, as well as in terms of institutional mechanisms of facilitating the implementation and enforcement of humanitarian law obligations at a domestic level. Somewhere I think the gap happens. Probably I think that this gap, why it exists, is because of the changing nature of the conflicts. Had there been a traditional understanding of a conflicts of interstate nature, probably states would have been willing to come forward to say that, because traditionally that has been the understanding. Somewhere I think when the conflicts are changing in nature in terms of they are becoming more and more internal in nature, means the challenge coming more from non-international armed conflict situations or non-state actors, I think somewhere the challenge is turning out to be much more serious, because even in law also, it is also a kind of an overlapping area between what we call broadly as in humanitarian law obligations and human rights compliance at the domestic level, which states would like to do that mostly as a kind of a constitutional criminal law framework rather than of international humanitarian law framework. Probably that is a challenge which is coming from the ground. It's not that the states are unwilling to do that. Probably I think that needs to be worked on, means that needs to be negotiated as to how you accept your international obligations, which have serious implications to your domestic situation rather than of an international situation. So that is one dimension which I think the states somewhere, there is a gap between what states accept and what states do at the domestic level. But the other dimension or other aspects which I would like to focus on is that some of those international treaties to which the state is not willing to accept those obligations as part of those treaties. An example being like, as pointed out by the chair, that whether the law is in compliance with the developments or whether the Geneva Conventions need to be amended or not. In fact, this issue was confronted by the international community much before, long ago, in fact, just after the 2 decades of the 4 Geneva Conventions, which led to the adoption of the 2 protocols then, that is in 1977, of course the other third one in 2005, which is specifically with regard to the emblem part of it. So therefore, states found that the inadequacy, or in fact there are certain gaps which exist as part of the Geneva Conventions, which were sought to be filled through additional protocol 1 and 2. And the other important political dimensions of these 2 treaties is that in fact it was the third world countries which were in the forefront, because some of those aspects which are with regard to the national liberation movements, so the status of a combatant in terms of redefining the combatant states, all of them were the contribution for the post-colonial states, because they were not addressed as part of the 4 Geneva Conventions. So in fact, they were pointed out during the four conventions negotiations, but for various reasons, they were not taken on board, which were taken on board during the Addition Protocol 1 and 2 negotiations. But for various reasons, many countries, of course, including South Asian countries, India, are not parties to it. Now, the question is not that why it is a party, why it is not a party. But what is more important is that what were the positions that were taken by some of the states like India when these two treaties were being negotiated upon, whether they are still relevant or not. In fact, one example, if we take it for India, they did not want to recognize the category of non-international armed conflict. They said that in an express manner during the negotiations in AP1 and AP2. They said that we accepted Common Article 3 in 4 conventions for the reason that anti-colonial movements should be considered as part of the IHL framework. But by 70s, since that is being considered as part of or being covered by AP1, so there is no need for AP2. And this is an argument which one can, it is a fair argument to make. But interestingly, if you look at other international treaties which were negotiated upon after 1977, India became a party to several international treaties which talk about non-international armed conflict situations. So therefore, the question arises is that whether India has to relook at as to its positions in relation to AP1 and AP2, which it do. But probably the circumstances have changed and its position has changed in respect of similar other treaties. Somewhere I think the position of India needs to be looked at in relation to AP1 and AP2 in the changed circumstances and the way it became a party to several other international treaties, which similarly address the questions of non-international armed conflict. I'm not saying that there are no other issues which cannot be addressed. Now, there are several other issues which probably are problematic as part of AP1 and AP2. But going purely by the text of India's positions during 1977, it looks like several of those issues have been resolved in a way in terms of India's positions in relation to that. Now, probably I think those aspects become extremely important, especially with regard to the Indian context, if you look at in relation to 4 Geneva Conventions part of it. But with regard to Addition Protocol 3, which in fact, with regard to the specific emblem part of it, it was in fact India which pointed out that there has to be a neutral emblem. So it is also a question that probably somebody has to take it up, that why, which India in fact asked for a neutral emblem, and which has become part of a kind of reality in 2005. Ideally, I think it should accept or become a party to the Addition Protocol, which specifically talks about the emblem part of it. So these are some of those issues, I think, in terms of the, so when we look at the report of the International Committee of the Red Cross about the challenges part of it, now, at the level of implementation and compliance part of it, there are fundamental issues which in fact are as old as Geneva Convention, as old as 70 years. Though the challenges are very many in terms of it, probably all of them, or at least many of them, can be fairly resolved or fairly captured if the effective implementation compliance mechanism in terms of becoming a party to the existing international treaties without getting into the new ones. Of course, that is always a welcome to have that thing, and effectively implementing them at the domestic level. I think if we can narrow down the gap between that, probably I think there is a much more respect to what is already part of the 4 Geneva Conventions as well as the 1977 protocols. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Burra, for going in great detail, particularly to the additional protocols. I personally learned quite a bit on that. And the question that comes to mind is that you said that you explained very clearly India's positions on the additional protocols. Now, are there other countries which have more or less a convergence with India's position? And if so, can India bring them together and take a leadership role in changing these additional protocols or modifying them? That will be worth looking at. Now, let me hand over the floor to Ambassador Asoke Mukerji, who has been a permanent representative in the US, and he knows the subject very well, and he is going to talk about India's contribution to global humanitarian operations and the way forward. And he has dealt with them very closely when he was in New York.
Thank you, Ambassador Viswanathan. Thank you all for inviting me. It was a pleasure to listen to Madam Svoboda. Thank you once again, and Professor Burra. What I'd like to do is focus on what they've asked me to, which is the ground situation as far as the impact of international humanitarian law on the ground is concerned for India. Now, India's own experience with international humanitarian law goes back 100 years, and that's something that most people in India do not remember. But the first time that chemical weapons were used in warfare was on the 22nd of April 1915, and they were used on Indian soldiers fighting in the British Indian Army in Ypres. It took almost 10 years after that, 1925, for the first convention to outlaw chemical weapons to be negotiated in Geneva in 1925. India ratified that convention. India was a member of the League of Nations, again, which most people have forgotten today, but we were there right from the beginning, and we ratified that convention in 1930. So the impact of chemical weapons in warfare is something that is known to India, that India itself has been sort of involved with, and therefore when looking at a crisis which we look at very often on our television screens in Syria, I think that this plays a role in the response that India has on the ground to allegations of the use of chemical weapons in the conflict in Syria, which is, as has been pointed out, not a traditional conflict, not an international conflict in that sense. It's a new conflict, a hybrid conflict, a conflict within the state of Syria. And how do we deal with it? So there are interesting positions taken by India in the organization OPCW, which is now responsible as an international organization for regulating that conflict on terms of chemical weapons. And India's position has been to support the OPCW role in addressing the impact of these weapons on civilians in Syria, as well as the combatants. The second formative event that happened for India again goes back, but this time to the Second World War, when India was part of the Allied armies, which also liberated many of the concentration camps in Europe. And India was part of the 17-country UN War Crimes Commission, which functioned in London from 1943 to 1948. And this is important because when Raphael Lemkin, whom most of us who deal with international humanitarian law issues remember very often for coining the word genocide, so when Raphael Lemkin wanted 3 countries to co-sponsor the resolution in the General Assembly's first session to negotiate the Genocide Convention, it was India, along with Panama and Cuba, who co-sponsored that resolution, and which led to the adoption of the Genocide Convention in December 1948. So outlawing a mass atrocity crime, again, is part of the DNA of India. Of course, India is an original member also of the United Nations. Before we became independent, we were signatories to the UN Charter, and there are reasons for that, which I don't think we should spend time on just now. But with this background, 1949, the 4 Geneva Conventions make more sense for a country like India, because we have had a kind of track record in dealing with issues of what today is called international humanitarian law on the ground. And on the ground, First World War, 1.3 million Indian soldiers, volunteers. Second World War, 2.5 million Indian soldiers, volunteers. After the United Nations created, 200,000 soldiers, again, volunteer soldiers, professional soldiers, serving under the UN flag in very, very difficult conflict situations, especially after the end of the Cold War, after 1989, when the nature of conflict, as the chair has pointed out, changed completely. I mean, earlier conflicts in the early part of UN peacekeeping were between states, but now we have a majority of these conflicts are within states. And how do the challenges of international humanitarian law impact on India's participation in the regulation of these conflicts? Now, India participates, as I mentioned, through her soldiers. We have the largest contingents in South Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. These are the 2 big volatile conflict zones where international humanitarian law issues are constantly raised. And I think that there is need, as has been pointed out, for focusing on how to deal with, as a peacekeeper on the ground, with the requirements of international humanitarian law. Now, it's a very sad situation to always talk about, that within the countries which mandate these peacekeeping operations, and they're basically the 5 countries, the permanent members of the Security Council, there doesn't seem to be any awareness of factoring in this obligation in the mandates that they give to the soldiers to carry out and implement. And I think the classic example of this was in the past 3 or 4 years in the way Indian UN peacekeepers have had to respond to the situation in South Sudan, where 1/4 of the population of that country has been dislocated due to conflict. Protection of civilians is the primary focus of the mandate, and yet there are no resources, political, financial, economic, you name it. Nothing has been given to these soldiers to actually respond. And I think that this is something that needs to be talked about. Now, moving quickly into the 2 areas which I think are also important for the discussion we're having today, there is an attempt, and I'm glad Professor Srinivas talked about the additional protocols, because the additional protocols also focus on one issue which is today become very, very important, and that is the issue of non-state actors in armed conflict situations. Now, in 1977, that may have seemed more a theoretical issue, but in the year 2019, the tremendous participation of non-state actors in creating human rights violations through their use of terrorism is something that is facing all of us collectively. And I think it's in that context that the proposal for a comprehensive convention on international terrorism actually assumes more salience, because the core of that convention, the requirement that India wants to get out of that convention, is the obligation on all member states to either prosecute or extradite people alleged for having committed terrorist offenses. And this principle of prosecute or extradite, which lawyers know very well, but the common population perhaps does not, is an extremely important principle. For example, for India, when it seeks to bring justice to the perpetrators of the Mumbai terror attack of 26 November 2008. We know where they are, but we cannot get them prosecuted or extradited to face justice. The second issue, which is important, is the impact of new technologies on international humanitarian law. Now, the new technologies include cyber technologies, and while there's reference in the concept note for this panel on the work being done by the governmental group of experts in the United Nations on developing norms which should be actually implemented by all member states on protecting critical national infrastructure, which has a tremendous humanitarian dimension, I think the fact is that the work of the governmental group of experts is today polarized because of the polarization among the major powers, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So the chances of this becoming a norm and then a law to add on to obligations for international humanitarian law for member states is not right now very bright. But I think it needs to be done because it affects a vast amount of the global population because of the nature of this technology, which today connects the whole world. I mean, everybody here in this room probably has a smartphone, and that illustrates the point very well, that each phone is actually both an empowering tool as well as a tool of vulnerability. I mean, you're exposed to this big vulnerability. And how do we deal with it? I think that when looking at it, and that's the last part of what I'd like to say, the Security Council needs to actually get its act together. And I'm not saying it just because I am an Indian who has been asking for Security Council reform, but by all objective criteria, they need to update themselves and become part of the 21st century. They have not done so. One of the major permanent members is openly against it, which is our neighbor to the north, China. But then there are other permanent members who are also not in favor of Security Council reform. So until that happens, the situation on the ground in conflict zones where the Security Council has deployed peacekeepers will continue to fester. And I think, unfortunately, the statistics of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees will keep mounting. When I started talking about this in 2013, it was 65 million. Today, it's 70 million. So you can already see in these last 6 years, the figure has gone up so much. And they're all, unfortunately, located not only in Africa, but also in West Asia and in Europe. So I think that this is something that needs to be done. The second thing that needs to be done is to bring in a different approach. And we, in the closing stages of our negotiations on sustainable development, really took this seriously, approach called the multi-stakeholder approach. And in this field of humanitarian law and its applicability in a universal framework, work is being done as I speak in forums which are outside the United Nations and its Security Council or its first Committee on Disarmament. There's a forum which is called the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. India's a part of it with 29 other countries. We have developed taking into account humanitarian law obligations, recommendations as best practices or norms for countering terrorism, for bringing justice to the victims of terrorism, things that were mentioned earlier in this panel. But until they become universally accepted and probably require a reworking of the Geneva Conventions, we may not be able to enforce them effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok. You mentioned India's contribution to peacekeeping operations. There, I would also add, India has also contributed significantly to stabilization in the post-conflict situation. And one of the things that was universally appreciated was the all-female police contingent, which was sent to Liberia after the crisis. And there was universal appreciation of this. So it is not only peacekeeping, but stabilization of the post-conflict situation. Ladies and gentlemen, all of you will agree that we had 3 excellent presentations from 3 different perspectives. So I'll leave the floor open. We have luckily enough time, at least 10-15 minutes for questions and answers. Please put up your hand, introduce yourself, and I'll request you to be brief because there will be many questions. And please indicate to which of the panelists your question is directed. Thank you. Here.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. My name is Simon. I am from the French Embassy. I would like to make 3 brief comments. First one on the challenges that are linked to new technologies, including artificial intelligence. I would like also to add an important Indian contribution on autonomous weapons and the instrumental role of India at Geneva to define guiding principles for the future autonomous weapons. And this is, of course, also linked to humanitarian law. From a French perspective, there is also, of course, a need for mobilization. Because during the last years, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in Syria, in Yemen, we have also seen some sort of erosion of the implementation of humanitarian law. And here, we definitely think that there is a role to play by the UN Security Council, and India may be at the UN Security Council in 2021 and 2022. And my country, together with Germany notably, has been very active on putting the emphasis also on the protection of medical personnel in conflicts. And we are very looking forward to working with India on this issue also at the UN Security Council or at any other fora. And concerning the role of peacekeeping operations, there is definitely a reflection to have on their means, their training. And we can also notice that in some areas of conflict, notably Democratic Republic of Congo, in the eastern part of it, the UN peacekeeping operations have done quite a good work to protect civilians despite a very difficult environment. So it is possible. But indeed, there is a need for equipment and training. The last comment I would like to make is that France, and together with Germany, has proposed a humanitarian call for a call for humanitarian action, which is a non-binding document to push states to adopt on a voluntary basis measures to enhance their national framework on international humanitarian law. 43 states have already endorsed it, and we are very keen on working with India towards an endorsement by the Indian authorities. Thank you very much.
Please, sir.
I'm General Kumar. I was H.H.S. Mukerji of the Army, 2001-2008. I have 3 comments. Firstly, with regard to the conventions, firstly I must compliment her for a very informative and interesting presentation, and after that my comments are, firstly, with regard to dissemination and compliance, you see, the 4 conventions, they cover the duties, the role, responsibilities of the personnel in the conflict situations, the entire range of persons, right from commanders to. Now there are different category of personnel. There are commanders, there are junior commanders, there are religious personnel. Conventions talk about the engineers for laying mines, prisoner of war cages, where the military police comes in, medicos, lawyers. Now in 70 years we find that there have been no manuals to enforce, to promote dissemination and compliance by these different categories of persons. That's the first thing. The second thing, I would say that mention was made about AP1 and AP2. Now, there is no policy to, and the other IHL conventions I am talking about, there is no policy, there is no scope for accepting, getting into these conventions with certain reservations. For example, say the Anti-Personnel Landmine Treaty. Now, the India may feel that on its borders today we need anti-personnel landmines, but maybe that 20 years from hence we would by then do away with the need of personnel landmines. But there is an approach, the only scope there is take it or leave it. Now that 70 years down the line, perhaps there is a need to accept and provide for reservations and exceptions. The third thing is that while these were framed in 49 and the main part was taken by the Western powers, the terminology used is quite complex, even for law personnel, and an effort to come up with simple commentaries that can be understood at the cutting edge level, that doesn't seem to have happened. I'll be happy for your comments. And the fourth is that we've been talking about the non-state actors. Now, with regard to the piracy that continues to sort of pose a problem, how do they fit into non-state actors? I'll be happy for your response on that. Thanks.
Yeah, at the back.
Yeah. My name is Adil and I'm from Kashmir. My name is Adil and I'm from Kashmir. I'm a student of peace and conflict study here in Delhi, and I have few concerns that you all panelists discussed about Geneva Conventions. And as someone also talked about terrorism and why does that come from and all these things. But as far as we students of peace know or study about terrorism, we can't find a single definition for terrorism separately. You're not just going to say that someone violated you, that's terrorism. That's as simple as that. So what's been happening in Jammu and Kashmir from the last 70 years, as we talk about the Geneva Conventions, or if we have read about the 4th Geneva Convention, where citizens should be given protection, civilians should be protected, or their religious customs and all these things should be protected, and they should be allowed to do whatever they want to do in a free way. It doesn't mean that you're going to label the issue with terrorism and you forget the Geneva Conventions. The more violations will happen to the Geneva Conventions, that will lead to the more terrorism. And the more oppressive policies will come towards the people who are in the conflict, there will be more violations of everything. And so what my concern is that what is India's stand? And as far as I have studied in Kashmir, and even if I talk about my family, my home, and what I've seen on the ground, they haven't, forget the humans, forget the Geneva Conventions and all these things. They haven't even spared the animals when they do the counter-insurgency operations in Jammu and Kashmir. How do they violate the animal rights there when they bomb down give that the name of the collateral damage? What is India's stand on that, and what is India doing that, and how do they justify that by labeling that with the terrorism, or by saying that it's an internal matter? They have already violated the Geneva Conventions, they have already violated the UN Security resolutions and all these things, and now they justify and talk about what they have done abroad and what they have done inside their country is far more greater, and it will have consequences, and we don't know where the future will lead to. That's my concern. Thank you.
Okay, that's the first round. So I leave it to the panelists. Pick up the questions and give your views. Go, Geneva.
Thank you. Not all the questions. I will maybe address some of the issues. I'm sure my colleagues will speak much more eloquently on others. Maybe if I could start with the non-state armed groups, and it's a question that you had asked also at the beginning. Just as a statistic, we have seen that in the past 6 years there have been more non-state armed groups that sprung up than in the past 60 years. So again, it's about this changing nature of warfare. Today we no longer have two state armies looking at each other, but non-state armed groups. And these are obviously bound also by the Geneva Conventions or international humanitarian law more broadly, even though they haven't signed them, but they clearly are bound by them. Now, the Icrc, the International Committee of the Red Cross, engages with everyone. It doesn't matter whether it's a state or a non-state armed group, because in our work, what we are trying to do is point out if there are violations, whether that's on the side of the state or the non-state armed groups. And that kind of dialogue that we do confidentially, so not publicly, is very important in order to raise awareness to their obligations. Now, some non-state armed groups, because they cannot sign these Geneva Conventions, because they're not a state, they, for example, do declarations. So they say that unilaterally we will adhere to these obligations. That's maybe one thing. Then on autonomous weapon systems, there was a comment, and indeed the group of governmental experts has been chaired by Ambassador Amandeep Singh Gill, 2017 and 18, and it is during that group where states try to define how autonomous weapons should be regulated, and in essence it boiled down to the human control. So autonomous weapons, when we look at them, what they do is basically they select and attack a target. And a lot of states, and also in the Icrc and civil society as well, are uncomfortable with the idea that a machine should choose whom to kill and at what point. So I think that's a very important process. And there has not been an agreement on how this human control or this machine-human interaction should look like. Then coming to your suggestion that we need more simpler language, and you're very right. I mean, you know, even if somebody has studied law, to read them and understand every detail, and you seem to be an expert, you have read them, they can seem quite complex. Although some of the principles are in fact quite simple, but the language as such is complex. And so what we try to do at the Icrc is, for example, we produce these very simple brochures or little booklets where really the simple principles such as distinction, so to distinguish between civilians and combatants and those no longer fighting, proportionality, precaution. We do that in different languages, but what we also do, and I mentioned that briefly in my speech beforehand, is really also to look at some of the values that are underpinned in different other cultures. So while the Geneva Conventions may have been codified in Geneva, but really the values that you find in them are actually universal. And so we try to make that link and make people understand that it's not a Western text or values that are in the Geneva Conventions. We did this research and we published a report which is called Roots of Restraint in War. And one of the examples that was given to us in South Sudan is one of the armed groups said, our favorite sport is wrestling, but we do not wrestle with the sick, with the elderly, or with children. And in essence, it's the same principle, that you do not fight those who are weaker. And so what we're trying to do is to say, look, these are the Geneva Conventions, but the values underpinning them are actually not that foreign. And so that's how we're trying to do that. Yes, maybe I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thank you.
A couple of comments, I think, specifically with regard to the legal part of it. The one is that whether some of those international treaties which have come up in the last 2 decades or so are not permitting reservations. I think that is a trend which is part of the international lawmaking process. Most of the treaties which have come from 1990s onwards are prohibiting reservations. So there is no possibility for states really to become a party to it by while ratifying to make a reservation. So that is a problem, which of course it's not a problem, probably there is a trend, international lawmaking process happening. But so far as additional protocols are concerned, there is a possibility of making reservations to it because they do not prohibit reservations to it. So therefore, we go back to Vienna Convention law of treaties and say possibility of making reservations for at least protocols is there, but for others like landmines, it prohibits completely. The other question is with regard to the piracy part of it. Probably I think you're referring to piracy in terms of on the sea that takes place. Okay, that piracy part of it is slightly legally, it's a very, very narrow definition that exists as part of the law of the sea convention, because most of the things that take place in the name of piracy are not technically piracy. It is an armed robbery which takes place. And if it, of course, if it takes place on the exclusive economic zone or territorial, especially territorial waters, that is more of a law and order problem of the coastal state. But if it takes place on the high seas, it is still again a law and order problem unless it is happening as part of an armed conflict. So therefore, otherwise it is outside the Geneva Conventions framework of it, primarily governed by law of the sea and the legal, the domestic criminal law of a country if it takes place in territorial waters, including some of the exclusive economic zone areas. But for high seas, still it is a kind of a broadly moves towards universal criminal jurisdiction of the domestic courts. With regard to the last question about the Kashmir part of it, yes, so far as application of humanitarian law is concerned, the primary requirement is that the existence of an armed conflict, and after the existence of an armed conflict, classification of armed conflict. So once we need to know whether the conflict exists or not, then we need to know whether it is the nature of the conflict that is international or non-international. Now, there are always a contending views, especially with regard to the conflicts which are of non-international nature. It's not only to do with India, many countries would like to have a different view vis-a-vis that. Probably they would like to regulate it as part of more of a law and order rather than of an international humanitarian law coming into picture. But we have seen after the 9/11 incidents, at least there is a general understanding within the international community, some of those states like United States also, their courts have held that at least Common Article 3 need to be respected. Probably the entry point is Common Article 3, even, it is my personal view, even in the context like Kashmir, I think that is where the memorandum of understanding between the Icrc and the government of India vis-a-vis Kashmir is a significant one, which is already there, I think. It is an agreement which it exists. Probably I think if that needs to be activated at least from the humanitarian law point of view, as a first step. Now, more has to happen with classification. That is a contested terrain which one can take a position. But purely from the humanitarian law point of view, I think that is a beginning which starting point one should take into consideration. Just as a last point is that with regard to the Comprehensive Convention on Terrorism, in fact, that is what India has done, and all entire treaty is ready except one issue, that is the savings clause. And very interestingly, the whole savings clause is centered around international humanitarian law, because the whole question is that whether those who are fighting for right to self-determination should be considered as a combatants or it should be law and order. So there also the IHL becomes extremely important for the Comprehensive Convention, because the only provision where the deadlock is that. In fact, the problem is not with the definition, but the problem is with the savings clause, and which is related to IHL.
I think that Professor Srinivas has just actually addressed that issue. And just to take one step back, this whole business of defining terrorism, I find is very difficult to understand, because in the international world, you have you have 50 resolutions of the Security Council on countering terrorism. So I can't imagine that 50 resolutions would counter something that is not defined. It's legally not possible.
Okay, we'll just take one more because we are.
Journalist with the Hindu newspaper. Couple of questions. One on the piracy. Is ICRC involved in any manner with the Indian government? Because there are hundreds of chapters from Somalia, especially, were passed over the years by the Indian Navy, because because of there's a bit of vague definitions there. They're actually sitting in Gujarat and other places. Navy doesn't know what to do with them, but they can't do anything, so they're being held in prison. So are you involved in some manner to resolve the issue? One, and any other, what other ways is ICRC engaged with the Indian government and in what areas? And finally, one thing in February when the aerial engagement happened in 26-27, Kumar was being handed over back to India from Pakistan. We heard ICRC was involved in the process. So can
those, no, we're not involved. Other collaboration on the peacekeeping, as Ambassador Mukerji rightly pointed out, India is one of the biggest troop contributing countries. And so we do some of the pre-deployment training and awareness raising on international humanitarian law, and in particular also on the situation where they then will be deployed. So that is a big area that we collaborate on. Perhaps as a last point, maybe I leave my colleague from the delegation here to respond, because he's better placed probably than myself to do that.
Sorry, what was the last point?
In February, during the crisis between India and Pakistan, Wing Commander Abhinandan was caught and then sent back to India. So we were told that ICRC was one of the ones facilitating the dialogue between two countries. So can you just say what the nature of it, essentially what was your role in that?
Sure, you were talking about the events following the war attacks when the pilot was captured in Pakistan, is that correct?
Indian pilot in Pakistan, yes.
No, the pilot was never handed over to the International Committee of the Red Cross. We did not have any involvement, no.
Well, we come to the end of a very, very interesting session. I wish it was longer. Probably at some point of time we should have more topics under this and have a whole day seminar of 3 or 4 sessions. Now, all it remains is for me to thank the panelists for taking the time on such an important occasion as the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Convention. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining. And thank you, all of you, in spite of this odd even and also the worst pollution that one has seen. You are brave enough to come and participate. Thank you very much.